On September 3, 1783, British and American diplomats signed the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the American Revolutionary War. Britain recognized American independence. The 13 colonies were now a sovereign nation. America had won. Britain had lost. The story was over, except it wasn't. Because if you look at what Britain actually wanted from the conflict, what they achieved and what happened in the decades that followed, a very different picture emerges. One where Britain didn't lose the Revolutionary War. They just redefined what winning meant. By 1815, 32 years after American independence, Britain controlled more of North America than it had in 1776. British trade with the United States was larger and more profitable than colonial trade had ever been. And the United States, despite its independence, was operating within a global economic system completely dominated by British financial and naval power. The traditional narrative says Britain lost 13 colonies and America won its freedom. But what if the real story is that Britain traded direct political control for something far more valuable? Economic dominance without the costs of administration. What if American independence was exactly what Britain's economic elite wanted? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is what the evidence actually shows when you look beyond the mythology. This is the story of how Britain might have actually won the American Revolution by losing it, and why the war everyone thinks they understand is far more complicated than the simple story of colonial rebellion versus imperial oppression. To understand whether Britain won or lost the revolution, you need to understand what Britain actually was in 1776. Not a unified nation pursuing a single strategy, but a collection of competing interests with fundamentally different goals. There were three main factions in British politics, each with different views on the American colonies. First, there was the king and his supporters, who saw the conflict as about authority and sovereignty. George III believed that allowing the colonies to break away would encourage rebellion throughout the empire and undermine royal power everywhere. Second, there were the old colonial interests, merchants who had grown wealthy on the regulated colonial trade system, where American colonists were required to buy British manufactured goods and sell raw materials only to Britain. These merchants wanted to maintain the navigation acts and the mercantile system that guaranteed them captive markets. But third, and this is crucial, there was an emerging group of industrialists, bankers, and free trade advocates who saw the colonial system as inefficient and outdated. These were the people driving Britain's industrial revolution. They didn't want captive colonial markets. They wanted to sell to anyone, anywhere, and they believed British manufacturing was so superior it could dominate global trade without artificial protections. This third group looked at the American colonies and saw a problem. The costs of administering, defending, and governing the colonies exceeded the economic benefits. The 7 Years' War, which had driven Britain to tax the colonies in the first place, had proven that defending American territory was enormously expensive. Britain had gone into massive debt protecting the colonies from France. So here's the question this faction was asking. What if we could trade with America, profit from American growth, and avoid all the costs of colonial administration? What if independence was actually better for British economic interests than continued colonial rule? When the Revolutionary War began in 1775, Britain's military strategy revealed deep ambiguities about what they were actually trying to achieve. Britain had the most powerful military in the world. The Royal Navy was unmatched. British regular troops were professional and well-equipped. If Britain had wanted to crush the American rebellion with total war, deploying overwhelming force and treating it as an existential threat, they could have. But they didn't. British military efforts were consistently half-hearted, underfunded, and hamstrung by political divisions back in London. Parliament was deeply split on whether the war was even worth fighting. Major political figures, including William Pitt and Edmund Burke, argued that the war was a mistake, that the colonies should be allowed to go, and that Britain's future lay in trade, not territorial empire. The British Army in America never exceeded 50,000 troops, including German mercenaries. This was a fraction of what Britain could deploy, and far less than they were simultaneously using in other conflicts. For comparison, Britain would later field armies of over 250,000 during the Napoleonic Wars. The American Revolution wasn't getting Britain's full attention or resources. British commanders were given contradictory instructions. They were supposed to defeat the Continental Army, but also maintain loyalist support, which meant they couldn't wage total war on the colonial population. They were supposed to occupy territory, but they lacked the troops to hold what they captured. They won most of the major battles, but couldn't translate tactical victories into strategic success. General William Howe captured New York and Philadelphia, the two largest American cities, and it accomplished nothing. The Continental Congress just moved, the rebellion continued, because Britain was trying to win a conventional war against an enemy that didn't need to win battles, just survive long enough for British political will to collapse. In September 1776, the Continental Army was trapped on Long Island. George Washington had made a disastrous tactical decision, and the British had surrounded him. British forces could have captured or destroyed the entire Continental Army, including Washington himself. The war would have been over. General Howe had the troops, the position, and the opportunity, and he didn't attack. He waited, gave the Americans time, and in the night, Washington evacuated his entire army across the East River in a desperate retreat that saved the revolution. Why didn't Howe attack? Historians debate this endlessly. Some say he was cautious by nature. Some say he was hoping to negotiate rather than destroy the rebels. But there's another possibility. Howe and the British government weren't sure they actually wanted to win decisively. A total military victory would mean Britain had to govern the colonies by force indefinitely. It would mean permanent military occupation, constant rebellion, and enormous costs. Some British strategists were already wondering if it wouldn't be better to let the colonies go and then re-establish relations on new terms. The turning point everyone remembers is Saratoga in 1777, where American forces surrounded and captured an entire British army under General Burgoyne. This victory convinced France to enter the war on the American side, transforming a colonial rebellion into a global conflict. But here's what often gets missed. Saratoga was a disaster of British strategic incompetence, not American military brilliance. Burgoyne's entire campaign was based on a plan that required coordination between 3 British armies that had no way to communicate effectively. The plan assumed the Americans would fight conventionally, and that loyalist support would materialize. Both assumptions were wrong. The British campaign that led to Saratoga was so poorly conceived that some historians have questioned whether London actually wanted it to succeed. The strategy made sense only if you assumed unlimited resources and competent execution. Britain provided neither. After Saratoga, British strategy shifted dramatically. They largely abandoned the northern colonies and focused on the south, where loyalist sentiment was supposedly stronger. This worked initially. British forces captured Savannah and Charleston and seemed to be winning. But then they faced the same problem. They could capture cities, but couldn't control the countryside. American irregular forces, not the Continental Army, made British occupation untenable. Britain was winning battles and losing the war because military victory wasn't producing political submission. By 1781, British political support for the war had collapsed. The costs were astronomical, the benefits were unclear, and Britain was simultaneously fighting France, Spain, and the Netherlands in a global conflict that threatened more valuable colonies in the Caribbean and India. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in October 1781, Britain still controlled New York, Charleston, and Savannah. The Continental Army was nearly bankrupt. The war could have continued, but Britain chose not to. Parliament voted to end offensive operations. Peace negotiations began. This is where the story gets interesting. Because what Britain negotiated in the Treaty of Paris was far better than what you'd expect from a defeated power. Britain recognized American independence, yes, but they retained Canada, which was larger and more economically valuable than the 13 colonies. They kept their Caribbean sugar islands, which generated more revenue than all the American colonies combined. They maintained their naval supremacy and global trading networks. More importantly, the peace treaty established terms that were remarkably favorable to British economic interests. The treaty required the United States to honor debts owed to British merchants, debts that totaled millions of pounds. It required Americans to compensate loyalists whose property had been confiscated. And critically, it established that American ports would be open to British trade. What Britain got was access to American markets without the costs of colonial administration. American merchants could now trade with anyone, but Britain's Industrial Revolution meant British manufactured goods were cheaper and better than anyone else's. The Navigation Acts were gone, but British economic dominance remained. Within a decade of independence, Britain was America's largest trading partner. By 1790, British trade with the United States exceeded the value of colonial trade in 1770. Britain was exporting more manufactured goods to independent America than it had to colonial America, and it wasn't paying for colonial governments, colonial defense, or colonial administration. In 1794, just 11 years after independence, the United States signed the Jay Treaty with Britain. This treaty was so favorable to British interests that it nearly caused a civil war in America. The treaty allowed British troops to remain in forts on American territory in the Northwest. It gave British creditors access to American courts to collect pre-war debts. It restricted American trade with French colonies during the French Revolutionary Wars, and it did almost nothing to address American grievances about British naval impressment of American sailors. When the treaty's terms became public, American crowds burned effigies of John Jay, the American negotiator. Thomas Jefferson called it a treaty of alliance between England and the Anglomen of this country against the people of the United States. Why did America sign such a humiliating treaty? Because economically, America was desperate. The United States needed British credit, British manufactured goods, and British markets for American raw materials. Despite political independence, America was economically dependent on Britain. Britain, meanwhile, could dictate terms because they knew the American economy would collapse without British trade. Independence hadn't changed the fundamental economic relationship. If anything, it had made America more vulnerable because the U.S. government was weak and divided while Britain was unified and powerful. For the next 30 years, American foreign policy was dominated by the reality of British economic and naval power. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain and France both tried to cut off each other's trade, and America was caught in the middle. Britain's Royal Navy stopped American ships, searched them for contraband, and impressed sailors they claimed were British deserters. This was a violation of American sovereignty that was even more egregious than the colonial-era policies that had helped spark the Revolution. But America couldn't stop it because Britain controlled the seas. The War of 1812, sometimes called the Second War of Independence, was essentially America's attempt to assert genuine independence from British economic and naval domination. And that war, as we've discussed, was a strategic failure. America didn't conquer Canada. Washington, D.C. was burned. The war ended in stalemate with the Treaty of Ghent that changed nothing. It wasn't until after the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815 that America finally began to escape British economic shadow. And even then, British investment, British credit, and British manufactured goods remained dominant in American markets for decades. So if we judge the Revolutionary War by its long-term outcomes, Britain achieved most of its economic objectives. They lost political control but maintained economic dominance. They avoided the costs of colonial administration while keeping the benefits of trade. And they demonstrated to the world that the future of empire wasn't territorial control, but economic influence. But there's a counter-argument that needs to be addressed. Because clearly American independence mattered. The United States wasn't just a British economic satellite. It developed its own political system, its own identity, and eventually became a great power that would rival and surpass Britain. The traditional American narrative argues that independence was necessary for everything that followed. That without political sovereignty, America couldn't have expanded westward, couldn't have developed democratic institutions, couldn't have become an industrial power in its own right. This is true, but it's also incomplete, because westward expansion, democratic development, and industrialization all happened within a global economic system dominated by Britain for most of the 19th century. America's growth was real, but it was also enabled by British capital, British technology, and British markets. British investors funded American railroads, canals, and industrial development throughout the 19th century. American cotton, the foundation of the American South's economy, was grown primarily for British textile mills. American economic growth was real, but it was also deeply integrated into British-dominated global capitalism. The question isn't whether American independence mattered. It clearly did. The question is whether independence represented a British defeat or a British adaptation to changing economic realities. Here's a number that captures the paradox. In 1770, the 13 American colonies represented about 20% of British overseas trade. By 1800, 17 years after independence, the United States represented 32% of British overseas trade. Britain's trade with independent America had grown larger than trade with colonial America, and Britain wasn't paying for American defense or administration. From a pure economic perspective, American independence was profitable for Britain. They lost political control but gained economic access. They shed expensive colonial burdens but kept lucrative trading relationships. So did Britain actually win the American Revolution? The answer depends on how you define winning. If winning means maintaining political control over the 13 colonies, then Britain clearly lost. American independence was real. The United States was a sovereign nation with its own government, its own laws, and its own foreign policy. But if winning means achieving your economic objectives while minimizing costs, then Britain's position becomes more ambiguous. The faction in British politics that wanted to maintain the old colonial system lost. But the faction that wanted free trade and economic dominance without colonial administration arguably won. Britain, in 1815, controlled more North American territory than in 1775. British trade was more profitable. British naval power was unchallenged. British capital dominated global finance. The loss of the 13 colonies didn't weaken Britain. If anything, shedding expensive colonial commitments allowed Britain to focus resources on more valuable imperial projects in India, the Caribbean, and eventually Africa. The American Revolution didn't end British power. It redirected it. Britain learned that formal empire was expensive and that informal economic empire, dominating trade, credit, and markets without the costs of direct administration, could be just as effective and far more profitable. This is why the revolution looks different depending on your perspective. For American patriots, it was a glorious victory, the birth of a nation based on liberty and self-governance. For British economic interests, it was a transition from expensive territorial colonialism to profitable free trade imperialism. The traditional story of the American Revolution is about political independence, but the economic story is about the evolution of empire. Britain lost political control of 13 colonies and gained economic dominance over a rapidly growing nation that would become one of the world's largest markets. They traded governors and garrisons for banks and bonds. They traded the costs of colonial administration for the profits of free trade. And for most of the 19th century, this was an excellent trade. The irony is that American independence might have been the best thing that happened to British economic interests. The United States grew far larger and wealthier as an independent nation than it ever would have as a collection of colonies. And for decades, that growth enriched Britain more than anyone else. So did Britain win the American Revolution? They lost the war. But in many ways, they won the peace. They lost an empire based on political control and built one based on economic power. And that second empire, the invisible empire of trade, credit, and industrial dominance, was far more powerful and far more durable than the first. The American Revolution freed America from British political control, but it took another century for America to free itself from British economic dominance. And by the time that happened, Britain had pioneered a model of empire that didn't require colonies at all, just markets, capital, and the global infrastructure to move goods and money anywhere they wanted. The United States won its independence in 1783, but Britain won the 19th century, and the revolution that Americans celebrate as the birth of freedom was also, from another angle, the birth of a new kind of empire. One that didn't need flags or governors, just banks, ships, and the industrial capacity to outproduce everyone else. That's not the story we tell ourselves about the revolution, but it might be closer to what actually happened. History isn't always about who wins the battles. Sometimes it's about who wins the peace. And in the peace that followed the American Revolution, Britain's economic elite got exactly what they wanted. Access without responsibility, profit without cost, and an empire that lasted long after the colonies were gone.